Some folks say a man's true nature shows in his eyes, not his gun belt, and young Deputy Riley was about to prove just how right they were. This is the story of how the West's most feared outlaws made their final mistake by mocking a quiet lawman who'd put more men in the ground than all their gang combined. Before we dive into this tale of hidden justice, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's story about the legendary mountain man who outwitted 100 bounty hunters might just be our best one yet. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you hit that notification bell because we've saved something extra special for tomorrow. Timber Creek shimmered like fool's gold in the Montana heat, its weathered buildings casting long shadows across the wind-carved main street. Most folks had enough sense to stay indoors during these scorching afternoon hours, but Deputy Thomas Riley sat motionless on the worn chair outside the Silver Star Hotel, his battered journal resting open in his lap, while his seemingly inexperienced eyes studied the pages with scholarly interest. A cup of coffee sat cooling beside him, untouched and forgotten in the dry mountain air. Unlike the grizzled gunslingers and hardened lawmen who typically wore a badge in these parts, Riley preferred the quiet dignity of the hotel's shaded porch. Old Man Harrison, who'd run the Silver Star for 20 years, had come to accept the young deputy's peculiar ways over the past 2 months. How he always sat with a clear view of both ends of the street. How his attention never truly left his surroundings despite appearing absorbed in his reading. And how his well-oiled gun belt seemed at odds with his bookish demeanor. The townsfolk called him Professor behind his back, their tone carrying equal parts mockery and uncertainty. Some whispered he wasn't fit to wear the badge, that Sheriff Kane had lost his mind pinning a star on a boy who looked more comfortable with books than bullets. But Old Man Harrison had noticed things others missed, like how Riley's chair was always positioned to cover both the bank and the express office, or how his right hand never strayed far from his gun despite his casual appearance. The hotel's patrons found Riley's presence puzzling, though none could say exactly why. Perhaps it was the way he moved, each gesture precise and calculated like a chess master planning his moves. Or maybe it was his eyes, blue as a winter sky but carrying shadows that no young man should know. Some said those eyes belonged to someone twice his age, someone who'd seen too much death to ever sleep soundly again. Sheriff Marcus Kane had raised more than a few eyebrows when he pinned a deputy's star on what looked like a fresh-faced boy from back east 2 months ago. The old-timers at McCarty's saloon had laughed openly, wagering on how long the educated deputy would last. But their laughter had died quick enough when Riley broke up his first bar fight. 3 seasoned miners laid out cold before anyone saw him move, his book tucked neatly back in his coat pocket like nothing had happened. The whispers about his past traveled through town like autumn leaves, each telling different but equally improbable tales. Some claimed he'd studied at Harvard before coming west. Others swore he was a former Pinkerton man hiding from his past. A few old-timers muttered about a legendary Army scout who disappeared after the Apache Wars, a man they called Shadow Walker for his ability to move unseen and strike without warning. But Riley never confirmed nor denied any of the stories, just kept to his books and his quiet observations. Miss Emma Clark, the young schoolteacher, was one of the few who'd managed more than a passing conversation with the deputy. She'd been surprised to find him well-versed in classical literature and European history, but there was something in the way he discussed military strategies that gave her pause. He spoke of ancient battles with the intimacy of someone who understood warfare firsthand, not just from books. The town's children had developed their own fascination with the quiet lawman. They'd made a game of trying to sneak up on him while he read, but somehow he always knew they were coming, greeting them by name without looking up from his pages. Little Tommy Jenkins swore he'd seen Riley practicing with his gun behind the livery stable one morning, moving faster than seemed human, hitting targets so far away they were barely visible. Even the hardened men who frequented McCarty's saloon had learned to watch their steps around the young deputy. Bart Hawkins, the saloon's bouncer and a former prizefighter, still wouldn't talk about the night he'd tried to test Riley's reputation. All anyone knew was that Hawkins had thrown one punch and ended up face down in the street, with Riley calmly helping him up like he was assisting a lady into a carriage. Sheriff Kane, for his part, seemed amused by the speculation surrounding his young deputy. When pressed about Riley's qualifications, he'd just smile and say, "Some men earn their reputation with noise and swagger. Others earn it so quiet-like you never see it coming till it's too late." Those who knew Kane's reputation as a judge of character took note of the steel in his voice when he spoke of Riley. The afternoon sun hung heavy in the Montana sky as Riley turned another page in his journal, his shadow stretching long across the hotel's weathered porch boards. Inside the Silver Star, Old Man Harrison watched through his front window, noting how the deputy's eyes flicked up at regular intervals, scanning the street with mechanical precision. Harrison had fought in the war between the states, and something in Riley's movements reminded him of the scout units, men who'd learned to look casual while staying ready to kill at a moment's notice. A hot wind rolled down Main Street, kicking up dust devils that danced like restless spirits. Anyone watching close enough might have noticed how Riley's hand drifted closer to his gun when three strangers rode past, their faces shadowed by wide-brimmed hats. The deputy's eyes tracked them with the same careful attention he gave his books, though he appeared not to have looked up from his reading. The peace of Timber Creek had held for 2 months now, longer than anyone could remember in recent years. But those who'd lived in the West long enough knew that peace out here was like a rattlesnake sunning itself on a rock, beautiful to look at, but deadly when disturbed. And for those who knew where to look, there were signs that the peace was about to be shattered in ways that would change Timber Creek forever. The afternoon's quiet shattered as 6 riders thundered into Timber Creek, their horses' hooves kicking up clouds of red dust that painted the air like blood. They wore the silver skull bandanas of the infamous Blackwood Gang, a crew that had been cutting a path of destruction across 3 territories with increasing boldness. Their leader, a monster of a man known as Iron Mike Blackwood, had left 16 lawmen dead in the past year alone. Old Man Harrison's weathered hands trembled slightly as he moved away from his window. He'd seen that silver skull pattern before, back when the gang had burned half of Copper Springs to the ground. The stories that followed them were the kind that made even hardened men check their doors twice at night. Some said Iron Mike had once killed a U.S. Marshal with his bare hands, though few lived to verify such tales. The gang's arrival sent ripples through Timber Creek like a stone dropped in still water. Shopkeepers quietly turned their door signs to "closed." Mothers hurried their children inside, and even the saloon's usual afternoon crowd found urgent business elsewhere. But Deputy Riley didn't move from his chair, didn't even seem to notice the approaching danger. He just turned another page in his journal, his movements as measured and unhurried as ever. The riders dismounted outside McCarty's saloon, their spurs ringing against the wooden sidewalk like funeral bells. Iron Mike stood head and shoulders above his men, his scarred face and massive frame making him look more bare than human. A matched pair of Colt peacemakers rode his hips, their ivory handles yellowed with age and use. Behind him, his brother Luke, the snake Blackwood, moved with the fluid grace of a born killer, while the others spread out with practiced efficiency. "Well, ain't this something special?" Iron Mike's voice rumbled across the empty street, carrying the gravel-rough edge of too many nights spent drinking raw whiskey. Whole damn towns rolled up its sidewalks except for some bookworm playing at being a lawman. His men laughed, but those watching from behind closed shutters noticed something odd. The way Riley held his book, not like a man lost in stories, but like a gunfighter might hold his cards in a high-stakes game, ready to show his hand. Miss Emma Clark, watching from the schoolhouse window, felt her heart race as Iron Mike's massive shadow fell across the young deputy. She'd seen Riley's eyes when he discussed military strategy, seen something deadly lurking behind his scholarly demeanor. Now she prayed she hadn't imagined it. "Hey, Professor," Luke Blackwood called out, his voice carrying the sibilant hiss that had earned him his nickname. "Ain't you got some learning to do somewhere else? Hate to see an educated man get hurt playing at being a real lawman." He fingered the knife at his belt, a wicked blade that had opened more throats than a drunk doctor. Riley finally looked up from his journal, and something in his eyes made Luke's hand freeze on his knife handle. They weren't the eyes of a bookish deputy. They were the eyes of a predator, calculating angles and distances with cold precision. For a moment, just a heartbeat, Luke Blackwood felt like a rattler that had stumbled into an eagle's shadow. "You know what I was just reading about?" Riley's voice was soft, cultured, carrying none of the fear they'd expected. The Battle of Thermopylae. 300 Spartans against an empire. Fascinating study in how overconfidence can be. He paused, marking his place with deliberate care. Fatal. Iron Mike's face darkened like a thunderhead. No one had ever accused him of being a patient man, and something about Riley's calm demeanor set his teeth on edge. Only thing fatal round here is going to be what happens to lawmen who don't know their place. Ain't that right, boys? His men muttered agreement, but there was an edge of uncertainty in their voices now. They'd faced down plenty of lawmen before, fierce old veterans and young hotheads alike. But something about this one felt different. The way he sat, the way he watched them, like a man who'd already seen how this would end. Found something else interesting in my reading, Riley continued, as if discussing literature at a social club rather than facing down 6 killers. About how ancient warriors could tell a man's worth by his eyes. They believed the eyes revealed what a man truly was, beneath all his decorations. His gaze flicked meaningfully to their silver skull bandanas. Sheriff Kane appeared in his office doorway, his hand resting casually on his gun. He'd known this moment would come eventually, known it since the day he'd pinned that star on Riley. The young man had warned him that trouble had a way of following him, though he'd never said exactly why. 6 men against 1 deputy hardly seems sporting, Kane called out, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years wearing a badge. But Riley raised his hand slightly, a gesture that stopped the older lawman in his tracks. Kane had seen that signal before, in the war, an officer quietly telling his men to hold position. "Oh, it ain't about sport, Sheriff," Iron Mike growled, his massive hands drifting toward his guns. "It's about sending a message. Timber Creek belongs to the Blackwood gang now. Any law that doesn't like it can leave vertical or horizontal, their choice." A strange tension had settled over the street, like the moment before a lightning strike. Old man Harrison, who'd seen his share of gunfights, noticed something peculiar. Riley's book lay closed now, but his hands weren't anywhere near his gun. They rested in his lap, relaxed as a sleeping cat. But Harrison had seen rattlers coiled just as casual before they struck. "Interesting choice of words," Riley mused, his voice carrying an edge of something ancient and lethal. "About leaving vertical or horizontal. Reminds me of another historical account I've been studying." He stood slowly, his movements liquid smooth like oil on water. "About a cavalry unit in the Apache Wars. 23 hard men against 1 scout they thought was easy prey. Fascinating story. None of them left at all." Luke Blackwood's face went pale. "Iron Mike," he whispered, something like recognition dawning in his eyes. The eyes. Remember what they said about Shadow Walker? How he'd talk all educated like before? "Shut your mouth," Iron Mike roared, but there was a new note in his voice. Fear, maybe, or the first inkling that they'd walked into something they didn't understand. The afternoon sun hung in the sky like a held breath, waiting to see what would happen when legend met legend on a dusty Montana street. The wind whispered through Timber Creek like a widow's prayer, carrying the weight of coming violence. Tomorrow would bring blood and judgment, but for now, a quiet deputy stood facing down death itself, armed with nothing but a book and secrets written in scars too deep to see. The tension in Timber Creek's main street crackled like lightning in a summer storm. Iron Mike's massive frame cast a long shadow in the afternoon sun, but it was Riley's smaller shadow that seemed to hold a darker promise. The young deputy's revelation had struck the outlaws like a physical blow, leaving them shifting uneasily in the dust. Inside his office, Sheriff Kane's mind raced through what he knew about the legendary Shadow Walker. The stories had become almost mythical over the years. Tales of a scout who could move like smoke through Apache territory, who'd single-handedly tracked and eliminated some of the deadliest war parties in the Southwest. The Army's official reports were classified, but Kane had heard whispers during his own military service about a man who'd learned the art of death from both native warriors and Eastern military academies. A woman's scream pierced the air from inside McCarty's saloon, shattering the standoff. One of the Blackwood gang had slipped away during the confrontation, and now old Charlie McCarty's daughter Jenny could be heard pleading for help. Iron Mike's scarred face split in a savage grin. "Seems my boy Rattler's found himself some insurance," he growled. "Now why don't you set that book down real careful, deputy, and we can discuss the terms of your departure from this world." Riley's response was unexpected. He smiled, not the nervous grin of a man buying time, but the cold expression of a wolf spotting a limping deer. "Interesting tactical choice," he said softly, his voice carrying across the silent street. "Using a hostage to alter the battlefield dynamics. The Mongols employed similar strategies, but they learned something crucial about hostage-taking." He placed his journal carefully on the chair behind him. "It only works if your enemy cares more about the hostage's life than you do." More screams came from the saloon, followed by the sound of breaking glass. Riley's eyes never left Iron Mike's face, but his words were pitched to carry. "Miss Jenny," he called out, his tone gentler now. "Remember what we discussed last week about the proper way to handle a rattlesnake? What happened next would be talked about in Timber Creek for generations." Jenny McCarty's voice shifted from fear to cold determination. There was a meaty thunk, followed by a man's agonized howl. Rattler came staggering out of the saloon doors, blood streaming from his nose, a broken bottle still clutched in Jenny's hand as she stepped away from him. "Just like you taught me, deputy," she said proudly. "Strike first, strike hard, and aim for something they can't protect." Iron Mike's face contorted with rage. "Kill them both," he roared, his hands dropping to his guns. But Riley was no longer where he had been standing. Like his old namesake, Shadow Walker, he seemed to flow between spaces, appearing beside Rattler before the man could recover. A single, precise strike dropped the bleeding outlaw face first into the dirt. "You know what fascinated me most about the Apache Wars?" Riley's voice remained conversational, even as he positioned himself between Jenny and the remaining gang members. How the best warriors could read a man's intentions before he moved. They called it listening to the shadow of his thoughts. His eyes met Luke Blackwood's nervous gaze. "Right now, your shadow's screaming about the knife you're planning to throw." Luke's hand had indeed been drifting toward his blade, but it froze at Riley's words. Iron Mike's brother had earned his nickname, Snake, for his speed with a blade, but something in Riley's stance suggested that throwing it would be the last mistake he'd ever make. "It can't be," one of the other gang members muttered, backing away slightly. "Shadow Walker disappeared years ago after that massacre at Ghost Creek. They said he died." "Many things died at Ghost Creek," Riley agreed, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Innocence, mercy, the belief that there were lines even bad men wouldn't cross." His eyes locked onto Iron Mike. "But sometimes what looks like death is just a shadow changing shape." Sheriff Kane watched the scene unfold, his hand still on his gun, but he knew better than to interfere. He'd suspected Riley's true identity the day the young man had applied for the deputy position. The way he moved, the precision of his speech, the hint of ancient death in his eyes. All of it had reminded Kane of stories he'd heard around military campfires years ago. "Ghost Creek was your work?" Iron Mike's voice carried a new note, something close to fear. 30 men, some of the meanest devils in the territory, all found dead in their sleep without a single shot fired. "You should read more history," Riley replied, his scholarly tone at odds with the deadly grace of his movements. "The Spartans believed that the most elegant victories were the ones where the enemy's defeat was assured before the first blade was drawn." He glanced at Rattler's unconscious form. "Though sometimes object lessons are necessary." Luke Blackwood had begun sweating despite the cooling afternoon air. "Brother," he said quietly, "maybe we ought to... Quiet." Iron Mike's roar carried the edge of desperate bravado. "I don't care if he's Shadow Walker, Ghost Dancer, or the devil himself. No man can stand against all of us." Old Man Harrison, watching from his window, noticed something that the outlaws had missed. As Riley spoke about history and warfare, His feet had been moving in tiny increments, positioning himself at precisely calculated angles to each threat. It reminded Harrison of a story he'd heard about a chess master who could see 20 moves ahead in any game. "You're right about one thing," Riley conceded, his hand still nowhere near his gun. "No man can stand against superior numbers. That's why Sun Tzu emphasized the importance of controlling the battlefield before the battle begins." His eyes flicked meaningfully upward, toward the surrounding buildings. "Would you like to meet the rest of my book club?" As if on cue, shutters creaked open all along the street. Rifle barrels emerged from the windows and rooftop positions, a dozen at least. Miss Emma Clark stood in the schoolhouse window, her father's Winchester held with comfortable familiarity. Old man Harrison had produced a shotgun that looked old enough to have seen service in the war between the states. Even young Tommy Jenkins manned a position, his small frame belying his steady aim. "You see," Riley continued, as if giving a lecture, "while you were focused on the obvious threat, the lone deputy reading his book, you missed the more subtle movements, the way the townspeople had been preparing, training, organizing. A classical example of misdirection, really. Quite fascinating from a tactical perspective." The afternoon sun hung lower now, painting the street in shades of gold and shadow. Iron Mike and his remaining men stood frozen, caught between their fearsome reputation and the reality of a trap that had been days in the making. Tomorrow would bring violence and justice in equal measure, but for now, a quiet deputy had demonstrated why history remembers that some of the deadliest wolves are the ones that look like sheep. Inside his office, Sheriff Kane studied a telegram that had arrived that morning, its yellow paper worn from repeated handling. The message explained far more than it revealed about his young deputy. "Shadow Walker confirmed active. Ghost Creek incident classified. Blackwood gang connected to military conspirators. Protect Riley at all costs. Colonel Harrison, 7th Cavalry." The sheriff's weathered fingers traced the words, while outside, an afternoon standoff was rapidly becoming something far more complex. Through his window, he could see Riley standing in the street, calm as still water, while Iron Mike's remaining men shifted nervously under the aimed rifles of Timber Creek's citizens. "Fascinating thing about military strategy," Riley continued his lecture, seemingly oblivious to the tension. "The moment you realize you're in a trap is usually long after it was set. The Byzantines wrote extensively about this." He adjusted his stance slightly, a movement so subtle most missed its significance. But Luke Blackwood didn't miss it. He'd seen men die from smaller shifts in balance. "Tell me something, deputy." Iron Mike's voice carried a desperate edge now. "Those military conspirators you tracked after Ghost Creek, they offer you more money than a deputy's salary, didn't they? To look the other way?" The street went deadly quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Riley's eyes narrowed slightly, the first crack in his scholarly demeanor. "Now that's interesting," he said softly. "I never mentioned military conspirators." Iron Mike's scarred face split in a knowing grin. "Maybe you ain't the only one who's been reading history, Shadow Walker. Maybe some of us know what really happened at Ghost Creek, how those 30 men weren't just common outlaws, how they were former military men working for someone with gold braid on his shoulders and blood on his hands." Sheriff Kane's hand tightened on the telegram. The pieces were falling into place. Why a man of Riley's abilities would surface as a small-town deputy. Why the 7th Cavalry was still tracking his movements. This wasn't just about law and order anymore. It was about something far darker. "The general sent us," Luke Blackwood blurted out, earning a murderous glare from his brother. "Said you'd be here. Said you've been hunting him since Ghost Creek, working your way up through his organization. He figured you'd surface eventually, trying to protect some innocent town." His laugh was bitter. Guess he was right. Riley's scholarly manner had vanished entirely now, replaced by something ancient and lethal. "General Marcus Blackwood," he said, the name falling like a death sentence. "Your uncle? I presume. The man who ordered those 30 soldiers to massacre an entire Apache village, then tried to blame it on raiders when the operation went wrong." wrong. Old man Harrison, still covering the street with his shotgun, felt his blood run cold. He remembered hearing whispers about that massacre, how a peaceful village of nearly 100 souls had been slaughtered, including women and children. The official story blamed it on raiders, but there had been rumors about a Rouge military operation and a lone army scout who'd discovered the truth. Uncle Marcus sends his regards, Iron Mike sneered. Says to tell you that every town you try to protect will end up like Ghost Creek. Every person you try to save will die screaming. Unless I stop hunting him, Riley finished, his voice carrying echoes of old pain. Unless I take his gold and forget what I saw that day. The same offer he made at Ghost Creek before I put 30 of his men in the ground. Miss Emma Clark, watching from her window position, saw something change in Riley's stance. The bookish deputy was gone completely now, replaced by a predator whose patience had finally run out. She remembered how he'd discussed military strategy with her class, teaching the children about the importance of knowing when to strike. Your uncle made a mistake, Riley continued, his words carrying across the silent street. He thought Ghost Creek broke me, made me soft, made me hide in books and seek peace. His smile was colder than a mountain winter. He never understood what those 30 deaths really meant. Meant? Luke Blackwood's voice cracked slightly. They meant I was willing to kill 30 men in their sleep, without firing a shot or raising an alarm, to get justice for those villagers. Imagine what I'm willing to do to the men who gave the order. Iron Mike's hand twitched toward his gun, but Riley's voice stopped him. Before you try that, there's something else you should know about Ghost Creek. Something that's never appeared in any official report. Young Tommy Jenkins, perched in his sniper position, saw several riders approaching from the north, men wearing cavalry uniforms. But Riley seemed unconcerned, as if their arrival was just another piece moving exactly where he'd planned. Your uncle thinks Ghost Creek was where Shadow Walker died, where the legend ended, Riley continued. But he's wrong. Ghost Creek wasn't an ending. It was training. The cavalry riders drew closer, their uniforms becoming clearer, but something was off about them, their movements too precise, their approach too calculated. Iron Mike must have noticed it too, because his face went pale. You see, Riley's voice carried the weight of carefully planned vengeance. While your uncle was focused on silencing witnesses and buying loyalty, I was building something else. A network of men and women who understood that sometimes justice wears a shadow's face. Former scouts, displaced natives, people who lost everything to men like your uncle. The cavalry riders had reached the edge of town now, and Iron Mike's remaining men realized what had been bothering them. These weren't regular cavalry. These were men who moved like Riley, each one carrying the same deadly grace, the same calculated precision. The Apache had a name for men like me, Riley said quietly. They called us shadow dancers, those who could step between worlds, between right and wrong, between justice and vengeance. Your uncle created me at Ghost Creek, thinking he was destroying what I was. Instead, he helped me become something far more dangerous. Sheriff Kane watched the pieces fall into place. The quiet deputy reading his books, training the townspeople in secret, positioning his people like pieces on a chessboard. It had all been building to this moment. The trap wasn't just the armed citizens or the hidden rifles. The trap was thinking Riley was hiding from his past, when in fact, he'd been preparing for war. The afternoon sun hung low in the Montana sky, painting the street in shades of blood and gold. Tomorrow would bring a reckoning years in the making, but for now, a quiet deputy stood revealed as something far more lethal than any outlaw's nightmare. A shadow with purpose, a ghost with patience, and a hunter who'd never stopped tracking his prey. The Montana sun cast long shadows across Timber Creek's main street as Riley's revelation hung in the air like gunsmoke. Iron Mike's face had transformed from confidence to something darker, the look of a man realizing he wasn't the predator in this hunt, but the prey. Uncle Marcus warned us about this, Luke Blackwood muttered, his eyes darting between the armed townspeople and Riley's approaching shadow dancers. Said if we found you studying books and playing deputy, it meant you were building something, Said it meant you were. His voice trailed off as Riley's cold smile widened. Planning, Riley offered. Your uncle always did understand military strategy. Shame he never quite grasped the concept of loyalty. His eyes swept the street, taking in positions and angles with mechanical precision. You see, General Blackwood made a crucial mistake at Ghost Creek. He assumed that, because I worked alone, I would die alone. The shadow dancers had spread out now, moving with the same fluid grace as Riley. Each one carried the mark of hard training and harder experience. Former scouts, displaced warriors, men and women who'd lost everything to corrupt power and found purpose in Riley's quiet vengeance. Sheriff Kane stepped out of his office, the telegram still clutched in his weathered hand. The 7th Cavalry's been watching, he announced, his voice carrying across the tense street. They know about the general's connection to the gang, know about the raids, the murders, the military supplies going missing. He fixed Iron Mike with a hard stare. They're coming, son, the real cavalry, and they ain't riding to help you. Iron Mike's massive frame seemed to coil like a threatened bear. You think we came alone, Shadow Walker? Think Uncle Marcus would send us in without backup? His scarred face split in a savage grin. Maybe you ain't the only one who's been planning. As if summoned by his words, more riders appeared at the edge of town, at least 20 men in mixed civilian and military gear. They moved with professional discipline, taking positions with practiced efficiency. These weren't common bandits. These were trained soldiers gone bad, men who'd followed General Blackwood into darkness. Interesting, tactical choice, Riley mused, as if discussing a chess move rather than facing down overwhelming odds. Using the town as a battleground, forcing me to worry about civilian casualties. He glanced at Miss Emma's position in the schoolhouse. But you're assuming the civilians are untrained. Another mistake. Emma's voice rang out clear and strong. Children, just like we practiced. To the cellar, quickly now. The sound of small feet moving with surprising discipline echoed from the schoolhouse. Not the panic of scared children, but the ordered evacuation Riley had drilled them on for weeks. You've been preparing them, Luke realized, his face paling. The whole town. All those books you've been reading. Military history, Riley nodded. Sun Tzu, Clausewitz, Sherman. Been teaching tactics disguised as story time. Amazing how quickly children grasp strategy when you make it into a game. His calm demeanor somehow made the revelation more terrifying. The adults took a bit longer, but Miss Emma's quite the natural teacher. Old Man Harrison's gruff voice carried from his window position. Best classes I ever attended, Deputy. Particularly enjoyed the lessons on urban warfare and defensive positions. Iron Mike's reinforcements had finished taking their positions, but something was wrong. Their professional confidence had begun to waver as they noticed details they'd missed at first glance. The way the townspeople's rifles covered perfect overlapping fields of fire. How every major approach was subtly channeled by wagons and barrels placed weeks ago, looking like random clutter while creating kill zones. Timber Creek wasn't random, was it? Iron Mike growled. You chose it. Been setting this up since you arrived. Before that, Riley corrected. I chose this town 6 months ago. The deputy position opened up because I arranged it. The telegram your uncle received about my location? I made sure he got it. His voice carried the patience of a teacher explaining simple mathematics. Everything that's happened, your arrival, your uncle's plans, even the position of the sun right now, it's all been calculated. One of Iron Mike's new arrivals, a former cavalry sergeant by his bearing, suddenly stiffened. The sun, he said, his voice carrying dawning horror. We're facing west. He's got us looking into the setting sun. Riley's smile was colder than a mountain winter. Very good. That's why I waited until afternoon to begin this particular lesson. The sun's position gives my people a tactical advantage in any exchange. Basic strategy, really. I'm surprised your uncle didn't consider it. Enough talk, Iron Mike roared, his patience finally shattering a nod. Kill him all! But Riley had already moved, flowing like water between patches of shadow. His voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. You know what fascinates me most about military history? How often the losing side realizes they're beaten only after it's too late to matter. The street erupted into chaos, but it was a controlled sort of chaos. Riley's shadow dancers moved with lethal precision, each one covering a specific sector. The townspeople's rifles spoke with well-trained accuracy, their positions carefully chosen to support each other. Even young Tommy Jenkins played his part, using his small size to run messages between defensive positions while staying in cover. Iron Mike's men found themselves caught in a carefully orchestrated killing ground. Every time they tried to advance, hidden defenders forced them back. Every time they sought cover, they discovered their position was already under someone's crosshairs. It was like trying to fight smoke, flowing, coordinated, deadly. Your uncle tried to bury the truth at Ghost Creek, Riley's voice carried over the gunfire, still maintaining that lecturer's tone. Tried to hide 30 dead soldiers and a massacred village under paperwork and bribes. But he never understood what he created that day. A shot rang out, and one of the corrupt soldiers fell. He thought he was making a ghost. Instead, he made a teacher. Sheriff Kane, watching from his covered position, finally understood the full scope of Riley's plan. The quiet deputy hadn't just been preparing for a fight. He'd been building an army. Every book read in public, every tactical lesson disguised as story time, every target practice masked as friendly competition. It had all been building to this moment. The afternoon sun hung low in the Montana sky, painting the battlefield in shades of gold and shadow. Tomorrow would bring questions and consequences, but for now, a quiet deputy was teaching his final lesson about the true meaning of justice and the price of underestimating a man who'd turned vengeance into an art form. The battle for Timber Creek had transformed the quiet Montana town into something from ancient military texts, the kind Riley had studied so carefully. Smoke drifted between buildings like war spirits, carrying the sharp scent of gunpowder and destiny. Iron Mike's men had discovered too late that they weren't just fighting a man or even a town. They were facing a carefully orchestrated symphony of death, conducted by a master who'd spent months preparing every note. Still think this is about a deputy's star? Riley's voice carried across the chaos, somehow remaining calm and professorial even in the midst of battle. He moved like liquid shadow between positions, each step calculated months in advance. Your uncle's reputation, his rank, his power, they're all built on the graves of that Apache village. And graves, as it turns out, make poor foundations. Iron Mike had lost 8 men in the first exchange, their tactical training useless against Riley's meticulously planned kill zones. The massive outlaw leader had taken cover behind an overturned wagon, his previous bravado replaced by desperate calculation. Uncle Marcus said you were dangerous, he growled, but this ain't natural. No one can plan this deep. That's because you're still thinking like a soldier, Riley replied, his voice now coming from a different direction. Following orders, thinking in straight lines. Ghost Creek taught me to think like a shadow, patient, fluid, everywhere and nowhere. A shot rang out, taking down another of Iron Mike's men who'd tried to flank the schoolhouse. The Apache believed that a warrior's greatest weapon wasn't his bow or his knife, but his ability to become one with the desert itself. I simply applied that principle to an entire town. Sheriff Kane, coordinating the town's defense from his strategic position, watched in amazement as Riley's plan unfolded. The quiet deputy hadn't just trained the townspeople. He'd transformed Timber Creek itself into a weapon. Every alley, every roofline, every shadow had been studied and repurposed. Even the way the setting sun cast shadows had been calculated into the defense. Luke Blackwood, separated from his brother in the chaos, found himself pinned down behind the saloon. "The books," he called out, desperation making his voice crack. "All those damn books you read in public, they weren't just for show, were they?" Sun Tzu spoke of appearing weak when you are strong, Riley lectured, as if they were having a friendly discussion over coffee. Each book was chosen carefully. Military strategies hidden in plain sight, discussed openly with anyone who'd listen. The art of war disguised as a young deputy's scholarly hobby. Another shot. Another of Iron Mike's men fell. "Your uncle should have paid more attention to my reading list." Miss Emma Clark's voice rang out from her position. "Second team, shift east, just like we practiced." The townspeople moved with coordinated precision, adjusting their positions to maintain overlapping fields of fire. Even Old Man Harrison, who'd initially scoffed at Riley's tactical lessons, executed his role perfectly. "You know what the most fascinating aspect of military history is?" Riley continued, his voice now coming from somewhere near the bank. "How often the deciding factor isn't the size of the army, or the quality of their weapons, but the preparation of the battlefield itself." A pause, filled with gunfire and screams. Timber Creek isn't just a town anymore. It's a lesson in strategic patience. Iron Mike, driven by rage and desperation, finally broke cover, firing his matched Colts with deadly accuracy at where he thought Riley's voice had come from. But he was shooting at shadows, at echoes, at a ghost who'd learned his craft in the hardest school imaginable. Ghost Creek wasn't your uncle's greatest victory. Riley's voice now came from directly behind Iron Mike, somehow both soft and as hard as cemetery granite. It was his greatest mistake. He thought he was eliminating a witness. Instead, he created something far more dangerous. A man with nothing left to lose, and all the time in the world to plan his response. The massive outlaw spun, guns blazing, but Riley had already moved. The sound of a book snapping shut echoed across the suddenly quiet street. Iron Mike found himself staring at the deputy who stood calmly in the open, a small, leather-bound volume in his left hand. "Interesting choice," Riley commented, nodding at Iron Mike's guns. "Drawing against a suspected ghost." The Greeks had a word for that kind of desperate action. Hubris, fatal pride. His right hand hadn't moved toward his gun. It didn't need to. "Would you like to know what I was actually reading all these months?" From his position, Sheriff Kane could see the book's title, and finally understood the last piece of Riley's elaborate plan. Iron Mike, sensing something significant, took an involuntary step backward. "Your uncle's personal journal," Riley continued, his voice carrying the weight of years of patience. "The one he kept during the Ghost Creek operation. Detailed records of every order, every payment, every name in his conspiracy. Found it on one of those 30 men I killed that night. Been reading it in plain sight, letting word spread back to your uncle that his darkest secrets were being displayed publicly, just waiting for him to send someone to recover it." Luke Blackwood's voice carried a note of horrified understanding. "We weren't sent here to kill you. We were sent here to spring your trap." "Very good," Riley nodded, as if approving a student's insight. "The real question is, who do you think arranged for your uncle to receive that information? Who made sure he knew exactly where to find me and exactly what I appeared to be doing?" The remaining corrupt soldiers began to realize the full scope of their situation. They weren't just caught in a tactical trap. They were part of evidence being constructed, witnesses to their own general's conspiracy being exposed. "The 7th Cavalry isn't coming to help you," Riley continued, his calm voice carrying across the smoke-filled street. "They're coming to arrest a corrupt general who just sent 20 armed men to attack a peaceful town. Your uncle finally made a mistake bigger than Ghost Creek. He documented his own crimes, then sent his own nephews to confirm his connection to them." Iron Mike's face contorted with rage and desperation. "Then I've got nothing left to lose," he snarled, his massive hands tightening on his guns. "Might as well take you with me, Shadow Walker." What happened next would be debated in Timber Creek for generations. Some said Riley drew and fired faster than human eyes could follow. Others insisted he never drew his gun at all, that Iron Mike's own shots somehow found their way back to him. But everyone remembered the quiet deputy's last words to the fallen outlaw. The greatest victory, according to Sun Tzu, is the battle not fought. But the second greatest? Riley's voice carried something ancient and final. That's the battle your enemy doesn't realize he's already lost. As the sun set over Timber Creek, painting the battlefield in shades of justice and shadow, a quiet deputy holstered his gun for the last time. Tomorrow would bring cavalry investigators and formal inquiries, but for now, a legend had finally completed his longest mission. Sometimes, the deadliest predator isn't the one that roars the loudest, but the one that waits in silence, reading books and teaching lessons about the true meaning of patience, justice, and the art of war. Sheriff Marcus Kane stood in his office, studying the official reports spread across his desk while Riley packed his few belongings. The morning sun painted Timber Creek in shades of gold, washing away the last traces of yesterday's violence. The 7th Cavalry had arrived at dawn, their officers more interested in the contents of General Blackwood's journal than in the bodies of his fallen men. "They'll court-martial him," Kane said quietly, his weathered hands sorting through the telegrams that had been arriving all morning. The journal, the witnesses, the surviving members of his gang. It's more than enough to bring down his whole operation. Ghost Creek will finally have its justice. Riley placed his books carefully in an old leather satchel, each volume a weapon that had served its purpose. Justice is a complicated word, Sheriff. The Apache had no word for it in their language. The closest they came was a phrase that meant the balance of all things. He smiled slightly. Perhaps that's more accurate. Outside, the town was already returning to its normal rhythm, though subtle changes marked the landscape. Townsfolk moved with a new confidence, their recent experiences having transformed them from simple civilians into something more. Miss Emma Clark's students were back in their schoolhouse, but now their history lessons carried deeper meaning. You know, Kane mused, watching young Tommy Jenkins practicing his quick draw in the street. Most folks would have just killed the general, gone for revenge instead of justice. What made you choose the longer path? Riley paused in his packing, his hand resting on the leather-bound journal that had helped spring his trap. At Ghost Creek, after I found those 30 men and the truth they carried, I had a choice. I could become the ghost they all thought I was, dealing death from the shadows. Or I could become something else, something that could change things rather than just end them. Old Man Harrison appeared in the doorway, his shotgun still close at hand despite the peace that had settled over Timber Creek. "You changed more than things, Deputy. You changed people, changed this whole town." His eyes carried a knowing look. "Changed yourself too, I reckon." "The art of war speaks of victory through transformation," Riley replied, his scholarly tone masking deeper emotions. "The greatest generals don't just defeat their enemies, they transform the battlefield itself. Ghost Creek transformed me, Timber Creek." He gestured to the town beyond the window. "This place transformed everyone." Miss Emma joined them, carrying a stack of essays her students had written about yesterday's events. "They're already turning it into stories," she said, a hint of amusement in her voice. "The quiet deputy who taught a town to fight, the ghost who used books as weapons, the shadow dancer who brought down a corrupt general with patience instead of bullets." "Stories are powerful things," Riley nodded, his eyes distant. The Apache believed that a warrior's greatest legacy wasn't in how many enemies he defeated, but in how many lives he changed. The stories people tell shape how they see the world, how they choose to live in it. Kane picked up one of the wanted posters that had been arriving, sketches of General Blackwood and his remaining conspirators. "What will you do now? The Army's offering you back your old position, full reinstatement, promotion, clean slate." Riley's smile carried echoes of Ghost Creek's shadows. "There are other towns out there, Sheriff. Other corrupt men hiding behind badges and ranks. Other places where justice needs to wear a quieter face." He shouldered his satchel. "Besides, I've grown fond of teaching." The townspeople had gathered in the street, word of Riley's departure spreading like wind through prairie grass. They didn't see a deadly ghost or a vengeful shadow. They saw a teacher who had shown them their own strength, a quiet man who had transformed their town into something legendary. You know what I find most fascinating about military history? Riley addressed the gathering, his professor's tone bringing smiles of recognition. How the greatest victories often go uncelebrated. The battles that change the world aren't always fought with guns and sabers. Sometimes they're fought with books and patience, with teaching and learning, with the slow transformation of ordinary people into something extraordinary. Young Tommy stepped forward, his small chest puffed out with pride. Will you come back someday, Deputy? There's still so much more to learn. Riley knelt to the boy's level. The most important lessons, Tommy, are the ones you'll teach yourself. Remember what Sun Tzu said about appearing weak when you're strong? This town might look like an easy target to some, but now it's got something better than a legendary deputy. It's got people who understand the art of standing together. As Riley mounted his horse, Miss Emma approached with one final gift, a new journal, its pages blank and waiting. For your next chapter, she said softly. The stories you'll write in your next town. The best stories, Riley replied, are the ones people write for themselves. Timber Creek's story is just beginning. He looked over the gathered faces, the shopkeepers who'd become strategists, the farmers who'd learned military tactics, the children who now understood that true strength often wore disguises. Sheriff Kane stepped forward for a final handshake. Ghost Creek made you a legend, he said quietly. But Timber Creek proved you're something more. Something we needed more than a ghost or a shadow dancer. And what's that, Sheriff? A teacher. A man who showed us that sometimes the best way to fight darkness isn't with more darkness, but with the patient light of knowledge. Riley tipped his hat, his quiet smile carrying more warmth than anyone had seen in his months of preparation. Keep reading, Sheriff. Keep teaching. The next generation of shadows might not need to dance with death if we teach them to walk with wisdom instead. As Riley rode east into the rising sun, the legend of the quiet deputy began to spread. Not just the story of how he'd brought down a corrupt general, but of how he'd transformed a town through patience and teaching. How he'd shown that true strength often wore the disguise of gentleness, and how sometimes the deadliest weapon a man could carry was the knowledge in his mind and the patience in his heart. If you found this story of justice and transformation compelling, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow we'll bring you the tale of a frontier doctor whose healing hands concealed a secret that would shake the very foundations of the West. Don't forget to ring that notification bell. Some legends are too important to miss. Word of what happened in Timber Creek spread through the territories like wildfire, carried by telegraph wires and whispered conversations in saloons. But while most folks focused on the dramatic gunfight and the fall of Iron Mike's gang, deeper currents were stirring beneath the surface of the story. Colonel Harrison of the 7th Cavalry arrived personally the next morning, his uniform pristine despite the dusty ride. He found Riley in the sheriff's office, methodically cleaning his gun while surrounded by military reports and telegrams. The scene reminded him eerily of Ghost Creek's aftermath. The same precise movements, the same calculating eyes. General Blackwood's gone to ground, the colonel announced without preamble. His estate was empty when we arrived. Seems someone warned him. His sharp eyes studied Riley's impassive face. Though I suspect you already knew that would happen. Riley continued his methodical cleaning, each movement precise as clockwork. Sun Tzu speaks of letting your enemy choose the field of battle, he replied calmly. But he also talks about making them think they're choosing it themselves. Sheriff Kane, watching from his desk, noticed something in Riley's tone, a subtle edge that hadn't been there before. You wanted him to run, didn't you? This wasn't just about his nephews and their gang. The general's journal provides evidence of his crimes, Riley explained, his professor's tone firmly in place. But a fugitive general fleeing west with his remaining loyalists? That creates something far more valuable. He finally looked up, his eyes carrying that ancient deadliness. It creates a trail. Colonel Harrison's face showed dawning understanding. You're using him to map his entire network. Every man who helps him, every corrupt official who looks the other way. Will be documented, tracked, and added to the evidence, Riley finished. Ghost Creek wasn't just one man's crime. It was the product of a system. Military officers, politicians, businessmen who profited from terror and murder. He began reassembling his weapon with practiced ease. You can't kill a system with one bullet. You have to dismantle it, piece by piece. Outside, Timber Creek was coming to life in the morning sun. But it wasn't the same town anymore. Citizens moved with new purpose, their recent experiences having awakened something that couldn't be put back to sleep. Miss Emma's students practiced their marksmanship as part of their regular lessons now, while Old Man Harrison had started teaching younger men the finer points of tactical positioning. They're building something here, Colonel Harrison observed. Something more than just a armed town. They're building a template, Riley corrected. A model for how other communities can stand against corruption. The general will realize that soon enough when he finds other towns mysteriously prepared for his kind of operation. Tommy Jenkins burst into the office, his young face flushed with excitement. Deputy, riders coming in from the east, but they're not military or outlaws, well, you better come see. The group moved to the street where a curious sight greeted them. A dozen riders approached, led by a weathered Apache scout and a former Army sergeant Riley recognized from his Ghost Creek days. Behind them rode men and women from various walks of life, former soldiers, displaced natives, frontier folk who carried the look of people who'd seen too much injustice. Your shadow dancers multiply, Sheriff Kane observed dryly. Not mine, Riley shook his head. They're their own people now. Each with their own reasons to want justice, their own scores to settle with men like General Blackwood. His eyes scanned the group with tactical appreciation. They've been watching, learning, preparing, just like Timber Creek did. Colonel Harrison shifted uncomfortably. The Army won't officially acknowledge any of this, you understand. Can't have it known that one of our generals massacred civilians and ran a criminal empire. The Army doesn't need to acknowledge anything, Riley replied, his voice carrying that teacher's patience. Stories will spread on their own, about towns that stand together, about quiet strangers who teach more than just tactics, about justice that wears a shadow's face. The new arrivals dismounted, each carrying weapons and equipment that spoke of serious preparation. But they also carried books, tactical manuals, historical texts, the same kind of reading material Riley had used to transform Timber Creek. You're building an army, Kane realized, his voice barely a whisper. No, Riley corrected, watching as Miss Emma emerged from the schoolhouse to greet the newcomers. I'm building a school. The Apache believed that knowledge was the greatest weapon, that teaching was the highest form of warfare. His smile carried echoes of Ghost Creek's shadows. The general thinks he's running from a ghost, but he's actually spreading exactly what we want. Fear among the corrupt, hope among the honest, and the seeds of something that will outlast any single battle. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across Timber Creek's transformed landscape. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, a quiet deputy watched as his greatest lesson began to spread. That true revolution doesn't come from the barrel of a gun, but from the pages of books and the hearts of people who decide to stand together against the darkness. 3 weeks after the Battle of Timber Creek, Sheriff Marcus Kane received a curious telegram from his counterpart in Silver Falls, 200 miles west. The message was brief but telling. Man matching Riley's description spent 2 weeks here last month. Left behind a reading group. Town just repelled Blackwood's remaining men without firing a shot. They never even made it past the outskirts. Thank you. Kane smiled as he added the telegram to a growing pile. Similar messages had been arriving from across the territory. Tales of quiet strangers with scholarly bearing who stayed just long enough to start book clubs, teach history lessons, and transform ordinary townspeople into something extraordinary. Another success? Colonel Harrison asked from his temporary office across the street. The military investigation into General Blackwood's crimes had given him reason to maintain a presence in Timber Creek, though everyone knew he was really there to watch something far more interesting unfold. "Silver Falls," Kane confirmed, passing him the telegram. "Seems our quiet deputy left more than just memories behind during his travels. He was laying groundwork long before he ever came here." The colonel studied the message with tactical appreciation. "Like pieces on a chessboard," he mused. "Moving them into position months or even years before they're needed. The general's running straight into a web that was built before he even knew he needed to run." Outside, Timber Creek had become something of a phenomenon. Visitors arrived daily, shopkeepers, ranchers, lawmen from other towns, all coming to see the place where a scholarly deputy had outsmarted the West's most notorious gang. But what they found was more than just another frontier legend. Miss Emma Clark had transformed her schoolhouse into something unprecedented. Children still learned their letters and numbers, but now they also studied military history, tactical thinking, and the art of community defense. Old Man Harrison had started a weekly discussion group where citizens analyzed historical battles and their applications to frontier life. "It's spreading faster than we anticipated," Colonel Harrison admitted, watching a group of townspeople practice coordinated movement drills in the street. Not just the tactical knowledge, but the whole philosophy. The idea that strength doesn't have to wear a gun belt to be real. Kane nodded thoughtfully. "Got word from Carson City yesterday. Their sheriff caught 3 of Blackwood's men trying to scout the town. Said they found something interesting in their saddlebags." He handed over another telegram. "Seems they were carrying a list of towns to avoid. Places where they'd heard rumors of shadow dancers and quiet men who teach more than books." The colonel's weathered face showed concern. "The general will figure it out eventually. Realize that each town he can't terrorize, each community that stands against him is another piece of Riley's strategy." "That's exactly what Riley wants." A new voice joined their conversation. Miss Emma stepped into the office, carrying a fresh stack of letters. "He told me once that the most powerful weapon against corruption isn't a gun or an army. It's the spread of knowledge that makes both unnecessary." The letters she carried were requests from other towns, asking for guidance in setting up their own training programs. Some were signed by local lawmen, others by school teachers or shopkeepers who'd heard the growing legends. All of them spoke of the same desire, to transform their communities from targets into bastions. "Found something else interesting," Kane added, pulling out a worn wanted poster. "Reports of General Blackwood's movements. He's not just running anymore. He's trying to gather forces, rebuild his power. But here's the fascinating part." He pointed to a list of locations. "Every town he's approached that might have offered him shelter, they all had reading groups start up in the past year." Colonel Harrison studied the pattern with military precision. He's being herded, he realized. Every safe haven closed off, every potential ally already turned. The only places left for him to run are the very places Riley wants him to go, Miss Emma finished. "Like he told us, sometimes the best way to win a fight is to make your enemy think they're choosing the battlefield." A rider burst into town, kicking up dust as he reined in before the sheriff's office. Young Tommy Jenkins, who'd appointed himself the town's official messenger, took the man's horse while he delivered his news. "Word from Copper Ridge," the rider announced, handing over a sealed envelope. "General Blackwood's been through there, but he found something waiting. A whole town organized against him. Someone had warned them, trained them. They say—" He paused, catching his breath. "They say a quiet man with books had visited last spring, started teaching their children about ancient battles and modern justice." Kane opened the envelope, revealing a detailed report of Blackwood's movements, along with something else. A page torn from what looked like a personal journal. The handwriting was unmistakably the general's. "Listen to this," Kane read aloud. "They're everywhere now. Every town I turn to, I find his shadow. Not just him, but what he's building. It's like trying to fight smoke. No matter where I run, I find people who've learned his ways, who stand together in ways I've never seen. He's not hunting me with guns anymore. He's hunting me with knowledge." Colonel Harrison's face showed grudging admiration. "This is why he was the best scout we ever had. not just because he could track a man across desert stone, but because he understood that real change doesn't come from force, it comes from transformation. Miss Emma sorted through her letters, pulling out specific ones. "It's not just about stopping Blackwood anymore," she observed. "These towns, these people, they're learning something bigger. How to stand together, how to face down evil without becoming it themselves. Riley's not just teaching tactics, he's teaching hope." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Timber Creek's main street, where citizens continued their drills and discussions. They weren't just preparing for trouble anymore, they were building something that would last beyond any single threat. "You know what fascinates me most about all this?" Kane mused, watching the town's transformation. "How a man everyone thought was a legendary killer turned out to be something far more powerful. A teacher who showed us that the strongest weapon isn't a gun or a badge or even an army. It's the knowledge that ordinary people, standing together, can face down any darkness." As the sun set over Timber Creek, more riders arrived from distant towns, each carrying stories of quiet resistance and growing strength. The legend of the scholarly deputy had become something larger than one man's quest for justice. It had become a beacon of hope in a territory learning to stand against corruption, not with violence, but with wisdom, unity, and the patient strength of shadows transformed into light. General Marcus Blackwood's final stand came not with the thunder of guns or the clash of armies, but with the quiet turning of a page. They found him in a small cabin near the Montana-Dakota border, surrounded by newspapers and telegrams detailing how his empire had crumbled town by town. His legendary nephew, Iron Mike, was serving time in a territorial prison. His network of corrupt officials had been exposed by a steady stream of evidence. And everywhere he turned, he found communities transformed by the shadow he'd helped create at Ghost Creek. The general didn't resist when the 7th Cavalry finally caught up with him. Instead, they found him reading, of all things, a worn copy of The Art of War that had been left conspicuously on his cabin's table. Inside, a handwritten note in familiar scholarly handwriting. "The greatest victory is the battle not fought. Thank you for teaching me that at Ghost Creek." Word of Blackwood's capture spread through the territories, but it was just one part of a larger story that had already taken on a life of its own. Tales of the quiet deputy who transformed towns through knowledge instead of violence had become something more than legend. They had become a template for change. Sheriff Kane received one final telegram from Riley, sent from somewhere in the vast expanse of the frontier. The Apache believed that when a warrior completed his mission, he didn't die. He became part of the wind, teaching his lessons to all who would listen. "The wind is rising, Sheriff. Keep teaching." In Timber Creek, Miss Emma's schoolhouse had become a beacon for other communities. Regular stagecoaches brought teachers, lawmen, and ordinary citizens eager to learn how a small frontier town had stood up to corruption and won through unity and wisdom rather than just force. Young Tommy Jenkins, no longer quite so young, had started teaching other children the arts of observation and strategy that Riley had shown him. "Deputy Riley always said the best warriors are the ones who can prevent a fight before it begins," he'd tell his students. "That's why we study history, to learn from the shadows of the past." Old Man Harrison's tactical discussion groups had spread to dozens of other towns, creating a network of communities that shared knowledge and stood together against those who would prey on the weak. His original copy of Riley's tactical annotations had been copied so many times that some said there wasn't a town west of the Mississippi that didn't have at least one page. Colonel Harrison, in his final report to the Army Command, wrote words that would eventually become part of military teaching doctrine. "The greatest victory we witnessed was not in the defeat of a corrupt general or the breaking of a criminal empire. It was in the transformation of ordinary citizens into extraordinary guardians of justice, achieved not through force of arms, but through the patient teaching of a man who understood that true strength often wears the quietest face." The legend of the ghost hand from Ghost Creek faded into history, replaced by something far more powerful. Stories of the quiet deputy who taught towns to stand together, who transformed territories not with a gun but with a book, who showed that the strongest weapons are the ones that live in the mind and heart. If this story spoke to something in your soul, if you found truth in the idea that real change comes not from violence but from knowledge shared and courage taught, then make sure you're subscribed to our channel. Tomorrow's tale about the frontier doctor, whose healing hands concealed a secret that would shake the very foundations of the West, is one you won't want to miss. Remember what Deputy Riley taught us: that legends don't have to die. They can transform, teaching new lessons to each generation that's wise enough to listen. The quiet deputy might have ridden on, but his lessons remain, carried on the wind to all who have the patience to learn them. You've got 2 more incredible stories waiting for you right on your screen. If this tale of transformation and justice touched something in your heart, you won't want to miss what comes next. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss a story from the wild frontier. Some say that even today, in small towns across the West, if you listen carefully in schoolhouse history lessons or watch closely in quiet reading groups, you might catch echoes of a gentle voice teaching ancient wisdom. And if you look into the eyes of those who stand together against darkness, you might see reflections of a quiet deputy who showed us all that the deadliest weapon isn't the fastest gun. It's the patient sharing of knowledge that transforms ordinary people into legends. The sun sets on our tale, but like all great stories, it lives on in the hearts of those who understand its deeper truth. That some battles are won not with bullets, but with books. Not with force, but with wisdom. And that the greatest legends are the ones that teach us how to become legends ourselves.